Hey everyone! Welcome back to another episode of Lover Girl. Alright, let me tell the in-depth story about one of the guys I mentioned in my 2024 dating life episode. His name is Ryan, and I met him out one night when I went out to see a show with my girl, Carrie. We went to see an artist from my hometown, so I was really excited. At the end of the night, I was standing at the back of the room sipping my water while Carrie was checking out her coat. When she was done getting her coat, she turned her head towards the merch table while walking towards me and said, "That guy's cute," nodding her head towards that direction. So I turned to look, and I had seen the guy I saw earlier. I didn't see anything special about him, so I grinned with my mouth closed. Then I switched my view to the person next to him. He was wearing a big white cowboy hat which went well with his dark complexion. I caught his eye, so I lifted my hand up to give him a wave. He lifted his hand up to wave back with no smile. I suggested to Carrie that we go check out how much the shirts are, so we headed towards the table. We began talking to the man with the cowboy hat, asking him about the shirts, and I noticed that while I was looking at him, he had his head down while talking to us most of the time, making very little eye contact. I asked him where he was from to create more of a connection with him. He mentioned that he was from a very close proximity near my hometown. I asked if he knew the singer because I had mentioned to Carrie that we should meet the main performer that night. He mentioned to us that he was his brother. It was typical of me to pry and ask more questions when something sounds unbelievable. He ended up telling me that they grew up together but wasn't related by blood. So I asked if he just went around traveling with him while on tour and asked what his real job was. He mentioned that he was a retired offshore fisherman, so he had time to go on tour. I asked him how old he was, and he told me he was 27 years old. I was taken back by a lot of the things he was saying. We then started talking about the shirts, and I asked what size he thought I should use. He replied with, "You're definitely a large." I was so shocked and offended by what he had just said. I was pretty annoyed at that point. So he told us the price, and Carrie convinced him that he should just give it to us. He smoothly handed us over 2 shirts. I felt a little bad about not paying for them, so I thought we better quickly head out of the venue. However, I still had been sipping my water, so the bouncer stopped me saying I couldn't leave with it. We stopped at a table near the door to finish up our drinks. I was still bothered by his comment, so I expressed my irritation to Carrie. She said that it was because I had been wearing a baggy sweater. I turned to him while feeling a little tipsy, lifting up my sweater. I said to him from across the room, "I am definitely not a large." His eyes widened when I did that. I found myself marching back towards him and repeated myself while Carrie followed behind me. She started up a conversation with him while I observed him, hoping that he'd behave a little kinder or maybe even flirt with me. I smiled warmly at him, but I was not getting anything. So I looked at his finger, and I noticed he didn't have a ring. I asked him what they were doing after, and he said that they were just going to hang out before they drove off to the next town. I gave him my phone and told him to enter his number, so he called his phone from mine. After we left, Carrie and I ended up at a bar nearby. We had another drink talking about our night. This guy ended up texting me, starting the conversation off very raunchy. I was appalled by what he was saying, but decided to play it cool on text. At the same time, I was telling Carrie how I was done and did not want to talk to him anymore. He mentioned that they were going to the strip club and said that we could come along. I had only been to a strip club once, and I did not feel like going to one at that point. I expressed this to Carrie, but she was egging me on saying that she hadn't been to one in a while, and we should just go. Carrie is married with kids, so I felt like she was trying to live vicariously through me. We headed back to the venue to meet him where their buses were parked. On our way there, I said to Carrie in a drunken slur, "I just want to kiss him and see." She asked if there's a spark. "Yes," I said. So we got back to where he was, and I stepped out of her car. I stood outside of the passenger's side and saw his white hat peeking out behind the back of the tour bus. "I'm gonna do it," I told her excitedly. She was so encouraging of my decision. I saw him running towards me to cross the street, and I began running towards his direction. "Hi," I said. I asked if it was just him, but he mentioned that a friend was joining. "Can anyone see us right now?" I asked. He said no. That's when I leaned my body towards his and whispered, "Kiss me." He held on to the back of my coat, pulling me closer while I rested my arm on his shoulder, holding the back of his head while my other hand held on to his coat. When my lips touched his, I thought, wow, his lips are so soft and he's kissing me so gently. It didn't feel sexual, it felt intimate. It was as if I was melting into him. The feeling was incredible. I didn't want it to end. His friend ended up joining us, and the four of us walked to a nearby strip club. While we were finding our way, I held his hand, noticing that he immediately pulled away. So I held on to his arm, which he allowed. It was a fairly chilly night, so we walked closely to get to our destination. We sat in an almost empty strip club, and while there, were all engaging in interesting conversations. Ryan and I were being flirty, sitting closely to one another. By the way he spoke about himself, he seemed very self-assured. A lot of the things he was saying about himself seemed far-reaching, like how he made a living, his assets, what he did with his time. It seemed like he was well accomplished at such a young age. I didn't know how much to believe. At one point, he brought out a bunch of bills and laid it on the table. Carrie and I looked at each other, communicating how shocked we were from the amount of money that was laid in front of us. I asked if he was going to tip the strippers, and he told me that it was for Nick so he could enjoy a dance. During our time there, he was behaving pretty brash, so I suggested to Carrie that we should leave several times. Ryan mentioned that they were headed to a bar and invited us to join them if we were up for it. We collectively decided to leave the strip club. On our way out, I grabbed Ryan's arm while we walked down the steep stairs and made a cheeky joke about my grip. We both shared a cute moment of laughter. Once we stepped outside, I suggested that he kiss me again. When he did, it was as great as the first time. We kissed over and over in front of a bunch of strangers waiting for the train, while Carrie and Nick walked ahead of us. It was difficult not to laugh with enjoyment or wipe the smile off our faces. I was still feeling tipsy from earlier, but this man was completely sober. We ended up posted at a bar 2 doors down. While at the bar, Ryan purchased all of our drinks as the heavy flirting between us continued. The more he talked about himself, the more interested I was. He told me his entire name and where he grew up. He mentioned how he owned a farm and had 2 horses. It seemed like he was feeling very comfortable with me and was willing to disclose so much about himself, which is what I liked. He then mentioned how the end of the tour was going to end in Las Vegas in a little over a month. He had planned to stay for a few days. He invited me to join him, saying he'd pay for my flight. I told him he was crazy, but he seemed dead serious, even pulling out his phone to purchase the tickets. He was prepared to buy them then and there. I didn't accept his offer, mentioning that I had to work. He said he'd pay for the work I missed. I was so taken back by what he was saying. Of course, I was tempted to take his offer, but I barely knew this man. When we left the bar, we continued to make out. The kissing was still pretty incredible. He mentioned how he wanted to come over to my place or get a room because he wanted to spend more time with me. Again, I was tempted, but I had to turn him down. We continued to kiss while Carrie waited for me in her car. He opened up the passenger door for me while we said our goodbyes. I had the biggest smile on my face. He had a couple of hours before he had to drive off to the next city. Ryan continued to text me after I left. He was so sweet with everything he was saying, telling me I was special, that he respected me, and mentioned how he thought I was a good kisser. He also said how he hoped to see me again. He even sent his schedule to try to plan for future dates, letting me know which days he had off, hoping he could fly me out to wherever he was so that we could spend time together. I noticed a complete 180 in his behavior towards me, from the beginning of the night to the very end. I felt grateful for that. After that night, we continued to communicate over text. We would send each other photos and videos of where we were and what we were up to, and even send each other songs that made us think of one another. We carried on with our flirting, and he was still insistent on flying me to where he was. After texting daily, I began feeling more comfortable with him. He mentioned to me how he wore his heart on his sleeve, and hoped I didn't end up hurting him. I never planned to. In fact, I was beginning to grow feelings for him. Every single day he'd say something sweet or thoughtful. Every single day he put a smile on my face. However, I did notice that a part of me was feeling anxious. I was aware that I felt this way whenever I started liking someone, because imagining the outcome of the situation would scare me. Yet, he somehow knew what to say to me to calm me down and make me feel better. He even sent me his location so that I knew where he was at all times, even though I never asked for it. Late at night after completing his work, Ryan would call me telling me how he wanted to hear my sweet voice. When I'd send him a mirror pic, he'd tell me it was my face that did it for him. He would tell me how amazing and beautiful he thought I was, and that my smile was contagious. I wondered how this man so much younger than me knew exactly what to say, and how to get into my heart. One evening I had not heard from him for most of the day, so I texted him. He ended up FaceTiming me, and when I saw his face, I could not help myself but smile from ear to ear. I was so happy to see him. He had the most beautiful smile while he looked at me, complimenting mine, even though I had been feeling insecure about how I'd look on video. He went around talking to other people while he had me on the call. I noticed how friendly and outgoing he was, which is what I admired about him. Then he put the phone down while a song began to play. It was one of his favorite songs by Jordan Davis called What My World Spins Around. It was a song I loved as well. He began singing along and dancing to it with so much passion and emotion, with a great big smile on his face. It was as if he was performing that song for me. I had the biggest grin on my face because he looked so happy, and in turn that made me happy. After that FaceTime call, we began having a more extensive conversation about our lives. During a previous conversation, he asked me how I was single. So during that call, I mentioned to him how I don't date, drink, or go out much because I'm a mother, and I spend a lot of time with my kids. It took him 2 hours to respond to that message, which gave me some anxiety. But when he did respond, he mentioned that he liked how I was a mother and told me he had 2 kids of his own. I felt relieved, loving the fact that he also had kids, since he was younger than me. There wasn't that pressure to have children with him if we did end up together, because I wouldn't want him to miss out on that opportunity if that was something he wanted for himself. One night we were on a call, and he jokingly called me by another woman's name in such a goofy manner. I knew he was kidding, but I didn't appreciate that joke, so I hung up. Immediately he tried to call back. Then he began texting me, apologizing and expressing how remorseful he felt. He felt really down about his decision to make that joke, and suddenly I began feeling bad for him. I didn't want him to feel down about himself for something so silly, so I decided to call him back. While listening to his voice, I could hear the regret in his tone. After communicating, we were able to get past it, and we continued to talk until the early morning, just getting to know one another. He even mentioned his children's mother to me. He wanted to speak about her in the most respectful way, mentioning how they had been together for a long time. He said how he gave her everything she wanted and needed, but he was always so busy with work, which caused a divide between them, and she ended up cheating on him in his home. He told me how he used to stalk her while she was out with some other guy, and would wonder to himself why he wasn't good enough to be loved. My heart tore apart when he told me this. I could truly feel his pain. At this point, I felt as though we were creating a real bond between the two of us. He also mentioned to me all of the things he liked about me, comparing me to her. The first night we met, he commended me on how he loved that I was a working woman. This confused me, because I wondered how people could even get by if they didn't. He said how his children's mother heavily depended on him for child support and didn't have much motivation to work because she didn't need to. He also mentioned how he admired my confidence and the way I carried myself. He basically made her seem undesirable, while making me feel like I was the most incredible person he'd ever met. We made plans to meet in New Orleans. I was excited to see him once again, yet at the same time I was feeling some angst, because yes, he was saying all of the right things. He knew exactly what to say to me, but much of the things he was saying seemed too good to be true, and when things he said to me didn't match up, doubt would fill my mind. When he didn't answer my call when I wanted him to, I'd feel upset. I would worry about him meeting other women on the road. I never worried about other women, so I hated that these thoughts were running through my mind. I did not like how I was feeling, so I found myself pulling away. After some consideration, I told him that I was not going to be able to make it out to see him. He did make an effort to change my mind, but I resisted. However, after I did this, I began having mixed emotions. Deep down I wanted to see him, but I wasn't completely sure what was the right thing to do. We continued to communicate over text, and of course it was typical of me to change my mind to then tell him that I did want to meet him in New Orleans. He asked me to send him places of where we could stay and mentioned that he'd send his card information so that I could book a room. At that point, I began noticing inconsistencies in what he was telling me and began feeling suspicious. I didn't like how I was feeling, so I decided to go out on a date with someone to distract myself from getting too hung up on this person. I just wasn't sure if he was being honest with me or not. However, even after going on this date, I couldn't get my mind off of Ryan. I had called him on the phone, hoping we could have a conversation and work things through as we had done previously. When he didn't answer, I sent him a stern text saying, "FaceTime me so you can lie to my face." He said he had been driving, was trying to find parking, and questioned what lie I was talking about. I then told him to forget it, and that I didn't need to hear anything he had to say ever again. After sending that text while being upset, I spent a few hours thinking about what I had said to him. I began feeling bad about what I had done, so I began writing him a paragraph of how I felt. I told him how I can get emotional at times, but I didn't want to get it to the point where I began doing damage with my words. I thought that we arrived at the point where we should end things, so that I could simply remember him in the best light. Then I thanked him for being engaging, loving and thoughtful every single day, and that I appreciated the person he was and all of the kind words and happy moments he shared with me. He responded with acknowledging that he'd been busy in his schedule, but wasn't sure how it felt like he was doing something wrong all the time. He mentioned how he wished he could just see me and make me happy, because speaking to me had made his experience on the road worthwhile. After that correspondence, I still felt so much love and care for him. A huge part of me wanted to start things back up, but it felt like he was disengaged. My girlfriend Mandy came from out of town to visit me. I thought we'd have so much fun I'd be able to get my mind off of Ryan. One night, Mandy and I were out at a bar. I had been drinking and was getting flirty with a lot of people. I noticed that so many men were trying to talk, flirt, and compliment me. Of course, I felt like I was on top of the world with all of this attention, but in the back of my mind, all I could think about was Ryan. I ended up FaceTiming him at the end of the night, surprised that he actually answered. When I saw his face with his beautiful bright smile, for a second I felt so happy, but I ended up hanging up on him because someone approached me to speak to me. After we had left, I called him back and could not contain the drunken words flowing out of my mouth. After we ended that conversation, I asked Mandy what she thought about how he spoke to me. She said he was very sweet to me and patient with what I was saying. I couldn't help but feel attached to him, yet at the same time I could feel him detaching. The next night, Mandy and I went to see Jordan Davis live. So many of the songs reminded me of Ryan. I began sending him clips of the songs. He had his read receipts on, so I knew he was viewing my messages. That night, I was having so much fun with Mandy, and I even met someone new. Yet even with all of this, my mind was stuck on him. I ended up drunk dialing him, professing how I felt. He patiently listened to what I had to say. However, he told me that I had taken him on a roller coaster ride, mentioning how I was self-sabotaging, the way I ruined things when they were going good. I felt bad when hearing this. No one had ever put my emotions or behavior in that perspective before, so I needed to step back and reevaluate myself. The next day I was browsing through Instagram, and I noticed that a woman who was touring with the band posted a video with him in her stories. I began obsessing, looking at videos while Mandy complimented on how beautifully she sang. That's when I received a text from Ryan. He had sent me a clip of one of Jordan Davis's songs. It made my heart happy to hear from him, and to think that that song reminded him of me. It had been his last week of the tour. I continued to watch stories of the woman who had been touring with them, hoping I could watch glimpses of him. I called him one night, mentioning I had seen him on social media on this woman's profile. I asked who she was, and he simply downplayed her, saying she was just an opener for the band. It made me feel better that he didn't put much importance on who she was to him. It seemed like he was still considerate of my feelings. He knew exactly what to say to me, as he always did. At the same time, I could still feel that void between us. It was the last couple of days of his tour, and I called him. I asked how much he missed his kids. He began ranting about his children's mom. I didn't make too much of it. But after that call, he mentioned how it was nice to hear from me again. I continued to watch the stories of the woman who was touring with them. One of her videos contained Ryan shaking his head, motioning for her not to record him. When I viewed that, I felt as though it wasn't for me. I wasn't the reason he didn't want her to record him, even though deep down I wish I was. A couple of days later I had texted him, and my messages was on delivered for 2 days. It had been unlikely for him to not get back to me, so I decided that it was time to delete his number and move on. A couple of weeks later I stumbled upon his Instagram. It was Mother's Day, and he had posted his children's mother mentioning how incredible of a person she was, basically saying everything completely opposite of what he had said about her to me. He even included the song, What My World Spins Around, with this post. I couldn't believe it. Seeing this was hurtful, and at the same time I wondered how I could ever trust a stranger like I did with him. But after staring at her photo, I realized it was his decision and his life. I had no place in it and was in no position to interrupt it. All I could think about was how I wasn't the one getting completely bamboozled in this relationship. That was when I realized that was the end of our story, and I was okay to walk away.